All right, the Tom Benty Media Podcast, the Thomas Alva Edison series. And this is episode number 5, our fifth and final episode. And this episode is entitled Growing Up and Moving On. And it is with Kathleen Carlucci. She's the director of the Edison Memorial Tower in Edison, New Jersey, the site of the Menlo Park lab that Edison famously created the light bulb and the lighting system that changed America and it changed the world. And in this episode with Ms. Carlucci, who has such a passion for Edison and all the things that he created and all the things that he did, and I highly recommend everyone checking out the Menlo Park Tower. It's a wonderful structure, beautiful structure, and it also in that little museum they have a lot of great artifacts. They have a lot of great pictures, and the individuals that work there, including Miss Carlucci, are just so knowledgeable, and they're so full of history and love for Thomas Edison. I really highly recommend everyone checking out the tower, the museum that they have there, and also I think they have a nature trail that a lot of people go on, and it talks a little bit about the history of Thomas Edison and his time at Menlo Park. So very, very much recommend everyone checking that out at the Edison Memorial Tower in Edison, New Jersey. But in this episode, we talk a little bit about Edison as a family man, his time in Newark, New Jersey. So before he went to Menlo Park, he was actually in Newark, but he wanted a better location for his laboratory. And I think he was renting in Newark, and he wanted to own his laboratory and do this full time. And Menlo Park was a great location for that. And that's when he comes to Menlo Park. His time in England, we talk about, and what he learned from that a very important trip, his approach to his work. How Edison changed the world with this new lighting system, working with J.P. Morgan, who was a big financier of Edison, especially early on in his career. How a chance encounter when Edison was a boy changed his life forever. His first invention, Edison's move to the East Coast early on in his adulthood. Edison, we talk about, he didn't just create technology, he didn't just create inventions, he created industries. And that's something we reference here. We also talk about the great friendship that Henry Ford had for Thomas Edison. And at the end of their lives, I think at the end of Edison's life, rather, they really became great friends, and they had summer homes in Fort Myers together, and they traveled the country together. But Henry Ford actually worked for Thomas Edison when he was a young man. When Edison was lighting America, he came to Michigan, and Henry Ford worked for Edison. And ever since then, he had such a love and admiration for Thomas Edison. Edison, we also talk about Edison creating the battery. So he created a car that can use battery power. And I thought that was interesting because that's something we're doing today. But Edison had the foresight and the intuition and the know-how to understand that maybe battery powered cars would be the way of the future. So that's pretty interesting. Edison, we also reference that he was not just a technologist. He was not just an inventor. He was really an international celebrity, one of the first of the day. And we reference that in this episode as well. What becomes of Menlo Park after Edison leaves? We talk about that. Henry Ford, again, we reference Henry Ford was such a big fan of Thomas Edison that he took the laboratory, the actual laboratory in Menlo Park that Edison created the light bulb with. He took that laboratory and he took the soil underneath that laboratory from Menlo Park, and he brought that to Dearborn, Michigan. So there's actually a museum in Dearborn, Michigan, showcasing the Edison laboratory, the real Edison laboratory that's in Dearborn. And that is just to showcase how much Henry Ford admired Edison, admired his work, and wanted to make it live on forever. So if you go to Dearborn, you can check that out. I haven't done it yet, but I hope to soon. And finally, we reference how Edison's light really, it changed the world. So it just changed how humanity lives. And I think that's really cool. But, thinking what are some things from this episode that I really took as a way that I could approach my work life and my entrepreneurial spirit, my creative approach. And I think the big thing is that Edison he never gave up. He continued. He always had his eye on goals, which I think is important. It's not just about setting up ideas that we want to do or goals that we want to do. He had a very systematic approach of going about it. So it was just a way of approaching work from a very systematic standpoint and understanding that in order to reach goals, there has to be a system in place. And Edison was really all about a system and a way of going about it, which I think can really relate to my own career goals, right? I'm a screenwriter. So let's say, I have an idea for a screenplay. Well, there's a process that goes into that. You have to flesh that idea out. Then you have to structure it, and then you have to write it, and you have to rewrite it and get feedback and rewrite it again and rewrite it again. But you never lose sight of the ultimate goal and the ultimate story involved. So I think that's really important as well. Just another great insight. We talk about some of the things we referenced in the previous episodes, but Miss Carlucci gives a nice insight to it. We talk, I think, more about Edison just as a person. And I know it's hard to differentiate between Edison, the man, and Edison, the inventor. There really doesn't seem much of a difference between the two. But I think in this episode, we get a more of insight into terms of who Edison was when he wasn't working in the laboratory. Which was rare, but he did spend some time outside of the laboratory, and we just get more insight into his work approach and all his great contributions and all the other famous individuals he met throughout the course of his career, and how he contributed to these great industries that we're still using and involved with today. So thanks again. I hope you learned a lot from this episode and from the episodes that I've created previously, 1 through 4. But I really, I had a great time doing this, and I learned a tremendous amount, and I just feel smarter from all this and more motivated and inspired, and I hope you do as well. And like I said, please contact me at any time if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to relate to. But really some cool stuff going right here in my hometown. Thomas Edison created the light bulb, was an amazing man, and did some amazing things. And some of the way that he approaches his career and his life, I think, can reference the way that we're doing work today. So again, thank you so much for listening. And this is episode number 5, the final episode with Kathy Carlucci, the director of the Edison Memorial Tower. And this episode is entitled Growing Up and Moving On.
Well, Edison was working and living in Newark, New Jersey, and he had a young family. And, it was a busy, congested city. It's the largest city in New Jersey still, and so he wanted to move out to another area. He had people looking around, and we think maybe his father found Menlo Park for sale. It was a failed housing development. And it was located right on what was then the Pennsylvania Railroad, now our Northeast Corridor. So it would be perfectly situated between, the big cities that he needed to go to with transportation. So Edison bought the property. It's a disparity between 34 to 36 acres in 1875, and he had his father, Samuel Edison, oversee the construction of the main laboratory. Edison, meanwhile, had traveled to England. He was doing research on the printing telegraph, the long transatlantic cable, which still amazes me today at that time to be having that kind of technology. And he learned a lot when he was there. He always learned a lot wherever he went. And he saw these amazing electrical test devices, and he bought some and brought them back to Menlo Park. Now, Menlo Park is just what this area here is called, but it was known as Raritan Township, and it will become Edison Township in honor of Thomas Edison in 1954. So Edison moves here to this beautiful area. It was picturesque, very hilly. It's still the highest point on the railroad from New York to Philadelphia, and they had long views of rolling hills. And so Edison moves here with his wife and his infant son in March of 1876. And he had taken a lot of money from selling some patents, and he had bought the land, he had had the laboratory built, and he filled it with everything he thought he could need to begin his work. And it cost him almost $40,000 in money of that time, which was a lot of money, he invested in his own future. And so Edison would move his family into what was then, I guess we would call it the model home, which was on the corner of Route 27 and Christie Street. It wasn't known as that then, also known as Lincoln Highway, Route 27. And his wife was, a young woman, with 2 small children. Her sister lived with them, and they also had a maid. It was a little bit of a lonely existence for Mrs. Edison because there was so much going on up at the lab that her husband spent long nights up here. He actually seemed to be somewhat nocturnal, loving to work at night, having parties with the men, food and fun in the middle of all the really hard work. Edison liked to work in a group. He had this idea, that he wanted to work with a lot of different people so that he could be more successful. So he brought in people who were experts in their individual fields. So he had machinists, he had glass blowers, he had physicists, mechanical folks, blacksmiths, and they all worked together under his direction. And they really created a sort of dream team, if you will, and they worked well together. Some of his other workers, some of the managing workers of his group lived in homes right on the property, and they had wives and children also, and so they would, work together and have fun together. So Edison's wife would, also have events with the other families, as I mentioned, but it was lonely, but she could get on the train and go back to Newark to visit her family if she wanted. And in the beginning, there wasn't as much activity. People ask us all the time, how many people worked here at Menlo? Well, the numbers varied because it depended on what the work was. So he started out with a small group. He worked with Charles Batchelor, a machinist from England that he had met in his Newark laboratory and worked for him there. And then he would add people on as he needed them. He would have Francis Upton come, who studied under some of the greats and had a very good education, getting the first master's degree in science from Princeton University. But other people were, people that were in trades, as I mentioned, glass blowers, blacksmiths. And Edison listened to what the men were telling him. They would work together in these tight groups. He was certainly the boss. He worked as long and hard, if not longer than a lot of them. I mean, he was 29 years old when he came to Menlo Park in 1876. He was a very young man. He soon found out, though, his work was increasing. They were getting, they were working on new projects, and so he was actually outgrowing the very long and tall laboratory building. So they later on built a machine shop, glass house, office building, and so the groups were in close proximity but separate. And they worked on whatever the projects were at the time. Edison did find that working here and doing research, as we all know, research is very expensive. And sometimes it doesn't pay off. Sometimes things don't work out, or it's not a sellable product. But Edison knew that, and he actually contacted Western Union, company he had worked with before, and asked for some money to help support the work they were doing here. And of course, he would continue to work with them, almost like as a consultant, if you will. Maybe not the right word, but he would do work for them also because he needed to keep the work going. And so Edison's working on, at the time he was working on many things. He always had many irons in the fire. But he starts working on an improvement on the telephone that Alexander Graham Bell had patented in 1876. Now, Bell wasn't the only person working on inventing a telephone. People knew that this technology was coming. He's just the person who actually got the patent for it. But there were many others, including Edison. The problem, though, with Bell's phone is it doesn't work very well. And so Edison is doing some research, and he hears something, which is really pretty ironic because if you read stories about Thomas Edison as a young boy, even a young man, and as he gets older, he has a hearing problem that gets progressively worse as he ages. We think part of it was from a family history, genetic history, and possibly also from an illness when he was a young boy. But there's stories about how it possibly happened, in all the books that we read when we were younger. But we think those are the two main causes. But still, he hears something. There's different tone levels, and he hears something, and it gives him an idea. And he draws a diagram, and he gives it to his Swiss-trained clockmaker, John Cruci, and he creates what Edison will call the phonograph. It's basically like two Greek words together meaning sound writer. And Edison has Mr. Cruci build it, and they're going to test it out. So Edison takes tin foil and he wraps it around the drum that he's drawn, and Mr. Cruci made very well. And he puts a stylus on, and then he attaches a horn to this diaphragm, and he speaks into it. And so a common verse at that time to do testing would be like, Mary had a little lamb. So he goes on and on, and he's turning his machine manually, the phonograph, and then he ends it, he moves it back, he puts another needle down on it, and he turns the wheel, and voila, you could hear a voice. He was pretty surprised it worked the first time, because he said he never had anything work the first time he tried it. But it was amazing. And so Edison would pack it up, and some of his men, and he would jump onto the train and go to New York and show it to an editor of a scientific newspaper, and they were wowed by this item. Edison has a very famous nickname. He's called the Wizard of Menlo Park, but it is because of the phonograph. This captured the imagination of people all over the world. They just could not believe this device worked. People would get up and testify that it worked. Some people were afraid of it. They thought the machine was talking. I mean, the science was just so unknown at that time. And today the education is so much better, for the populace than they had at that time. At that time it was like the very rich were educated really well. Other people went into trades, but today, opportunities are afforded to a lot more people of all diverse cultures and countries, and so it was really an amazing thing. And Edison will become the most famous man in the world because of this device. Now, many people were also at the same time working on lighting. I mean, people had been working on lighting, trying to make a light, an artificial light, if you will, for probably more than 80 years, in earnest. And Edison is just one in a long line of people who is working on this invention. He goes to see a demonstration of what was available at the time, which was arc lighting. So he goes up to Ansonia, Connecticut. He sees a demonstration, and he's wowed by this and thinks, I can fix the problems with this lighting system. One of the issues with lighting, arc lighting, was it was dangerous and it was very bright. And so they had put it, they had it down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. They even put it in the Louvre Museum, but the artists were appalled because it washed the color out of their paintings. So it wasn't a good inside a home or business answer to the issues of the darkness at night. So Edison would work on that. I mean, this is a time when people basically went to bed when the sun went down, unless you had money for candles or gas. You turned the lights out and went to sleep. And so nighttime was a very quiet time. And, Edison would continue to work on the light. He thought it would be a lot quicker than it wound up to be, but maybe 18 months later, he finally perfects incandescent light. Now, again, he is not the only person working on this. People are working all over the world. But what Edison does here at Menlo Park is he creates an electrical distribution system to go with this light bulb that now lasts for a significant amount of time. You know, other people created light bulbs. Joseph Swan from England actually worked on incandescent lights, but they didn't last for an amount of time that made them commercially viable. But the difference between Edison and some other inventors, you know, that we hear and read about is he didn't invent things. He invents systems. So when he did the perfects incandescent light, he creates an electrical distribution system. And that took a lot of study and a lot of time. And he would do that here at Menlo Park. And what he would do is he would you know, have faith in his abilities, but he kept working at it, trying to make it better and better. He was very sure and understanding that it was his name, you know, that was on this, and he wanted to make sure that this worked well and safely. And so Thomas Edison, you know, he drove the men that worked here with him just as hard as he drove himself. And he had investors, you know, like J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, and a lot of other rich people of the day who wanted to invest in this technology. And he was very excited to show the demonstration, but some of his backers were a little worried because sometimes things didn't work out exactly right. Maybe there was a bug, you know, one time they saw a demo and it didn't work, and so they didn't want to dash people's hopes. But Edison had a lot of faith in this system, and so he announced, you know, to the newspapers and sent telegrams that he was going to do a demonstration here at Menlo Park on New Year's Eve, 1879. And he, you know, ordered his men to hand make all these light bulbs. They laid all the wires underground. Nothing was above ground at that time, and to light, you know, the buildings that were here and the street. And so all these people come in, like thousands of people come to see by train, you know, walking or by carriage, you know, on a cold wintry night on New Year's Eve to see him do a demonstration. And he turns a wheel and he wows the world's imagination with this beautiful light that they could look at. And it was as if he turned night into day. And so, of course, now Edison has really cemented his reputation. But he wants to create systems for cities. So he does get permission from New York City to create like a 1 mile square demonstration in New York. He'll put his plant, you know, where the electricity is going to be created, on Pearl Street in New York, and he lights it, and people are thrilled with what's happening. His partnership with J.P. Morgan will actually come into fruition as the Edison General Electric Company, which later on, when Edison is basically bought out of it, it's known as General Electric, GE, we know today. And so Edison had many partnerships with many different people on many different inventions that he works on. He will create 400 of his most important patents here at Menlo Park in less than 7 years. And he'll go on to create 1,093 US patents and 1,250 patents in 34 different countries. I mean, he just kept expanding and expanding. Now, after he gets the electrical industry, you know, on its feet, he actually starts working again on his phonograph, because the problem with the tin foil was as soon as you could play a recording once or twice, but then tin foil being what it was you could make impressions on it and then it no longer worked correctly. And so there were a few other people who thought that phonograph had possibilities as a commercial product, not something Edison actually thought about exactly at first. And so they create the Bell, Chichester Bell, cousin of Alexander Graham Bell, because the phonograph is very closely associated with the phone. As I mentioned, it was really where it got derived from in Edison's research. And so they're creating these wax cylinders to do recordings on, but Edison will always say that the phonograph, throughout his life, that's his favorite invention. He called it his baby. And so he starts doing research on it. He wants to keep that under his umbrella, if you will. And so Edison just doesn't make the machines work better. He will create the recording industry. So there's another industry that we have that he works on. And he has many different phonographs all over in many different shapes. And there's some right behind me. And these machines, some of them are over 120 years old. And they are original. And you know what? They still work. And one thing you'll find with Edison's products, if it's his, it'll have his name on it somewhere. And a lot of his research done here really became major inventions later on. You know, we can trace a lot of things that we have today on Edison patents from a long time ago. And one of the brilliant things he did, and he learned this early on from a patent attorney, is write everything down in notebooks. And that's what he did, and then he would have people sign them, because one of the disadvantages of working in industry is there's a lot of suing, you know, because as I mentioned, many people are working on the same things at the same time, and it was who got it first. So you would have to keep detailed records. Well, those records are an amazing boom today that we're still studying and learning from. Another example of something Edison worked on was something called the Edison Effect. He was trying to figure out why the inside of the glass would turn dark, you know, the carbon. And so he was trying to stop that because it would actually shorten the life of the light bulb. And so he told one of his men to put a probe inside. And when he did that, you could see this activity going on. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was important, and so he patented it, and it's called the Edison Effect. We'll find out approximately 3 years later through research done in Europe that those were electrons that just didn't have strong enough microscopes at that time to see what they were. So it was really amazing. You know, Edison really did try to make the lives of the people living better. He really did want to do that. There were things that he invented that he didn't patent. He let them in the public domain. But you know, the things that he did invent, you know, he did do the best he could with them. Now, he only lived here, you know, until 1884. He was working in New York, but coming back and forth. But his young wife, Mary, would pass away not that long after the birth of a short time after the birth of their third child, William Leslie, who was born here. She just really never seemed to recover, and she had been ill for a while. We don't know exactly how she died or what she died of, but you know, there's a few different things that could have been. She may have overdosed with the morphine that she was taking, you know, for her migraines and her other ailments. And that's the current understanding or you know, idea. But she was only 29 years old. Edison was heartbroken. He moves his 3 children, his daughter and 2 sons, to New York with him. And he continues working on the biggest project of his life, creating the electrical distribution for New York City. And then, of course, it'll go to other towns. You know, we think of towns now, they're all almost grown together. You know, you lead from one town into the other, but it really wasn't like that back then. And so you had these separate towns, and you had to create ways to create electricity to have power for those towns. And Edison really worked very hard on that and did a very good job with it. Edison will remarry after 2 years after his wife's death, and he will move to what was known as Orange, New Jersey, now known as West Orange. And a short time after that, he'll create another invention laboratory in West Orange, which is still there today. He moved out of here for a few reasons. One was his work was in New York, and so he needed to oversee what was going on there. Also, when he does remarry, he asked his wife, do you want to live in the city or do you want to live in the country? She wanted to live in the country, and that was country where they lived. I mean, when he and his second wife lived in West Orange, like they had cows, they had chickens, they had all of that in that community. So yeah, it was really countryside. It was a lovely home here at Menlo Park, beautiful, but he'll buy an 18-room mansion later on because now he's very successful. So Thomas Edison, people ask us all the time, where was he born? Was he born in the United States? He was. He was born in Milan, Ohio, in 1847. His birth home is still there. You can actually go visit it. It's really quite lovely. It's right next to where the canal was. So it was a canal town and a very, very successful town. They were doing really well. But you know what? This was a time when he was a boy of a lot of expansion. So, his father hears that there's a train that's going to be coming into Port Huron in Michigan, not that far away. And the town fathers of Milan didn't want the train. They thought the canal was fine, but he was looking to better the circumstances of his family. So they moved to Port Huron when Edison is 7 years old. Edison was one of 7 children of Nancy and Samuel Edison. Only 3 of their children lived to adulthood because of childhood illnesses being, what they were, and the lack of medication and probably nutrition, I would think also. So now Edison moved from this really lovely town, small though, to this really large, almost like a metropolis, I guess you would say at that time. And he could see so much around him. I mean, there were all these like factories and ships coming in, and there was so much to see and learn about, and his world was really opened up. Edison actually started school not that long after they moved there for the first time. He had been a sickly child. We think he had scarlet fever. That may be part of what affected his hearing. But his mother signed him up for school, and he went, but as we heard Dr. Israel say, the teacher thought he was addled, or perhaps it was another reason, but his mother kept him home. She didn't feel that the reverend who was teaching them knew how to teach an intelligent child. And so she had been a school teacher before her marriage, and so she taught Tom to read. And he really developed such a love of reading, and he loved reading about so many different subjects, and they encouraged him. His mother said, by the questions he asked me, I knew he was really a bright boy, and so he just kept reading and learning, and he wasn't afraid of making a mistake or failing, and he was left on his own a lot. We have so many things right now, like trying to get our attention, but back then it really wasn't. There's no television, there's no radio, the newspapers are even limited, and so Edison spent a lot of time reading books on science. He liked to say he did every experiment in his science book. He becomes a very gifted chemist later on in life, starting from his early days experimenting. When he was 12, he asked his parents if he could get a job, and so his father made arrangements for him to get a job working on the Grand Trunk Railroad, selling newspapers and candy. And so, Edison was really someone who paid attention to what was going on around him. He really was a very good observer. And he's walking up and down the aisle selling, his goods, and he'd hear people say they, had to stop at the market to get tomatoes or milk or whatever it was, and or they were hungry, and so he figures out ways to bring those items in and sell to them, and that way his own family made the money, because he would turn all the money over to his mother, and then she would give him an allowance, which most likely he bought chemicals with. And he was also really excited about this brand new technology. At that time, the height of technology was the telegraph machine. And he's working on a train, and where are all the telegraph offices? Primarily, they're in the train stations. So he would get off at the different stops. They would go from Port Huron all the way to Detroit every day, and then it would have a 3-hour layover, but he would stop off and pick up things and drop off things, and he would hear the telegraphers talking about, what was in the news. And what was in the news at that time? The Civil War. And so Edison was hearing ahead of most people what was happening. What was happening at the Battle of Shiloh, what was happening, in Europe. He was hearing all of that because he would stop in. And he had built his own telegraph, following directions in a book, and he had memorized Morse code, he and his friend, and they would practice. And Edison was so excited. He would ask, can you show me something? But, the telegraph was the main communication system, so they were busy. So, sorry, kid, we're just too busy right now. Until one day, Edison is going into work, and he sees a little boy playing by the railroad tracks, and he sees that a train is coming towards the boy. A freight car got loose, and the brakeman's not able to get the brake, taken down, and so Edison makes this split-second decision that will change his life forever. He drops everything in his hand, he dives in, and he, rolls over with the baby, saving both of them. And we find out that the father of the baby is the head telegraph operator at the station where he had been, and as a reward, he offers to train Edison as a telegrapher. And that would really start Edison, on his path of working with technology. He would be what they called an itinerant telegrapher. So he would travel, up to Canada, down south in the United States. He'll finally wind up when he's 21 years old in Boston, where there's this really great telegraphic community. And he liked to work at night for Western Union, so he could keep his days open to work in the Charles William shop, and making his own inventions and selling them, like in the local trade magazines. And he was, doing a good job and working really hard and loving it. And so Edison gets an idea to create this machine called a vote recording machine. And he had read something that gave him the idea. One of his friends evidently had some inheritance, and he would, combine, their resources together and patent this machine. Edison is, as I said, 21 years old. He makes his first patent. He had done other inventions, making machines, the telegraph machines he was working on, better, but he never quite had the money for the patent, which, if it was $15, that would have been out of his reach. That was a lot of money at that time. So Edison, his machine is displayed for the legislature, how he intends it. It basically was that each legislator would have one of these machines in front of them. There was a yes and no button. A chemical would drop, depending on which button they pressed, onto a pre-treated piece of paper. And, machine, the voting would be quicker. The machine would make everything go faster. And the folks at the legislature said, why would we want that? Why would we want to have voting go quicker? We need time to filibuster, discuss the issues. And so it didn't sell. It was a failure, but, in typical fashion, Edison would think, that's not a failure. Look what I learned from this experience. And so he would really be broke now. There was an offer now of a job, because he'd given up, his job to work on this project. But one of his friends, his telegraph friends, Franklin Pope, was working in a division of Western Union called the Golden Stock Company in New York City. And he said, well, there's a job here for you if you can get here. Edison finally borrows some money. He takes a steamship from Boston to New York. When he shows up, the job's filled. I guess it took too long. But Edison's able to sleep in a cot in the back room that Pope tells him he can while shopping around for a job. And Edison comes back to the shop one day and everything's in uproar. The machine isn't working. Pope spots Edison, maybe outside the door, tells him to come in and help him out before he loses his job. And Edison sees there a little spring out of place. He fixes it, and he's the hero, and he's offered a position. And that's like another big step for Thomas Edison. And he'll work for William Orton, president of the Western Union and Golden Stock Indicator Company. And Mr. Orton takes an interest in Edison. He sees something in him and really supports his endeavors and offers him time and money and materials to improve Western Union's products, like their stock ticker and their telegraph machines. And Edison, that's like a dream come true. And so he will work with Franklin Pope, and together they will create what we know as the universal stock ticker, which basically will revolutionize the machine because it adds a unison coil in that will make sure that everything is done sequentially, that it doesn't become out of sync again, which is what one of the problems were with the other telegraph machines. And to the amazement of Edison and Pope, they were offered over $40,000 or almost $40,000 for that device. And Edison says again, that's it. I'm not going to work for anyone anymore. I'm going to be an inventor. He thought there was no greater calling than being an inventor. Some people want to be, president, or they want to be a baseball player or a chemist or a dancer or a singer, whatever. But to him, that was the height of what you could achieve, an inventor. And he will always think that for his whole life. And so Thomas Edison, he was living in Pope's mother's house, renting a room in New Jersey. So he'll eventually open up a shop in Newark, New Jersey on what was then called Ward Street. It's now Edison Place in Newark. And he'll be making improved stock tickers, and he has a new partner, and telegraph machines. He's working on fire alarms, all different things. And he's got ideas of how he wants to make inventing faster, more efficient. And he's writing down ideas with his friend, Charles Batchelor, who had come over from England, and the machinist. And he had met a young woman, Mary Stilwell, that he falls in love with. She worked for his company, testing machines, and they marry Christmas Day, 1871. They will have 3 children together, Marion, Thomas Jr., and William Leslie, born here at Menlo Park. And he's got these ideas running around his mind. And at that time, he's thinking, I want to move out of Newark because it is a very busy and congested city. He does not own the building, he's renting it. And he wants a better life for his family. And so he'll move to Menlo Park. And and then he just succeeds so much. And when he does have these successes, people will come from all over the world to see what Thomas Edison is doing at Menlo Park. After the invention of the phonograph, people are coming to see the light. He actually has a problem with a little early industrial espionage and has to put locks on the door and have a guard, because there were some issues. But he just has that attitude of going forward. And as I mentioned earlier, creating these industries. It'll be later on in his life that he'll work with motion pictures. A lot of the work, though, is being done by his one of his workers, William Dixon, for the motion pictures. But he'll create the motion picture industry also. They're not just these standalone items. They really are things that grow, and people can't imagine not living without them. It's like we need them, like we all need cell phones today. So So yeah, Henry Ford worked for the Edison Company when he was a young man in Detroit, and it was enthralled with Edison. I mean, everyone was. People would, he would be in the crowd, and they would just, gravitate towards him. But Henry Ford really developed like almost idolizing Thomas Edison, and they worked together on a few different things. So did Harvey Firestone, from Tire Company. Edison would work on an invention with him. It was the last patent in Edison's life. It comes out after Edison passes away. But Henry Ford idolized Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford was really so rich. He creates he gets the idea for the assembly line, and so cars are more affordable, and everyone has them. And actually, he pays people pretty well at that time, which was unusual. So Edison traveled around the United States because he had facilities in different areas. He would go down to Texas and light, a town there, or he'd go out to California and light this new hotel. Edison also creates, how were boats and trains going to get electricity? So Edison improves tremendously storage batteries, and so that you could have electricity on boats and trains, any moving object. So Edison traveled all over. He went all over Europe. He was in Paris, he was in Germany, he was in England. He really was an international celebrity. And he liked to, talk to the other inventors of that time and learn from them and share knowledge. I mean, that's what they used to do. They used to write letters and have these scientific journals like Scientific American, which is still being, published today. And they would write, their articles about what they were doing. Edison had, he didn't push his beliefs on other people, but he held, firm to his own beliefs on things. And he did, want to learn. One interesting story, and I don't know if it is just a story, but I have read it a number of times, is so this young physicist, Francis Upton, who studied under Helmholtz in Germany, gets that first graduate degree in science from Princeton, comes here with a wagon full of books, of things that he had studied. And they're working on trying to figure out the filament. Edison was looking at using platinum for the filament. Platinum was very expensive then too, but they were searching for that, seeing if that was going to work, well. And the story I read was that Upton had the book open, the textbook open, and Edison looks over at him and he says, Upton, what does the book say? What's the melting point for platinum? And Upton looks at the book and he said, there's no melting point, it doesn't melt. And Edison looks at him and he says, the book's wrong, Upton. It was kind of like that trust and verify. So he really taught people, just don't accept what's written. And he's famous for hiring people like a chemist or an engineer and moving them to different departments other than what they, their subject matter was focused on, because he wanted educated people, but he didn't want them to just assume from what they read in a book was correct. And sometimes those folks would come up with great ideas that somebody else didn't even think of. So he really was about education and promoting the idea of learning. I mean, Edison will get a gold, what's it called again? Congressional Gold Medal for the work that he did. And when he died, the president wanted to dim the lights, the story is, in his honor. And all over the United States, like turn electricity off. And they came back to him, they're like, people will die, we can't do that. We are so dependent now on it. But that's how deeply people, felt about him and honor him. And so he was held in state up at West Orange, and people came through, for I don't know how many days to view, the great man, Thomas Edison. He really was that well thought of. And I can tell you that we get visitors from all over the world. In 2019, we had folks here from 62 different countries, and every state in the USA coming to learn more about Thomas Edison and what was done here at Menlo Park. So he is still admired today. So Edison would leave Menlo Park, and he will come back and do research on the electric train, which really was to test the distribution of electricity here. The buildings remain, but no one's taking care of them. Local folks were using the laboratory as a dance hall for special events. We have some photos actually where squatters moved into his office and library. I mean, you know, we talk about this with our school groups that come. You know, what was a family to do if if a husband died and he was the breadwinner? Where were they to go if they didn't have money coming in? And, you know, so people moved in here and, you know, and then later on when the buildings start crumbling, local people would say, well, there's some good wood that's been, you know, through, you know, all cut up and perfectly done. Oh, maybe I can add some of that to my, my shed in the back, or some of the buildings became chicken coops. I mean, it really was sad. I mean, he did come back. He came back in the early 1920s because Henry Ford, who idolized Thomas Edison, they were friends, but Henry Ford idolized him, wanted to take all the buildings that were once here and bring them out to his new museum, the Henry Ford Museum, you know, out in Michigan. But the buildings were basically dilapidated and on the ground. The only building Henry Ford takes from here is the boarding house, the Sarah Jordan boarding house, which was the first home lit with Edison's electric light. Some of Edison's workers lived in the house. It was just 1 block away from Edison's home, actually closer to the lab site. And there were 2 twin houses next to one another, but the Sarah Jordan boarding house was picked up piece by piece and brought out to Michigan. The glass house had originally been removed from here and moved to Schenectady, and then later donated to the Henry Ford Museum. So that is an original building, but not taken directly from here. So the buildings, you know, weren't here. Henry Ford took what he could, but one thing he was important to him. He took the soil the buildings were on. So all the buildings at the Henry Ford Museum are on New Jersey topsoil. And Edison was nearing the 50th anniversary of incandescent light, the Golden Jubilee, and Henry Ford wanted to open up Menlo Park, his Menlo Park, out in Michigan in honor of Thomas Edison. Edison was in his early 80s. He wasn't really feeling all that well, but of course he did go out there. There was actually a celebration held here at Menlo Park where a large metal tower with the shape of a light bulb was put on top. That was put here. The eternal light was put underneath. That was in cement. Edison's 3 children from his first marriage were here at Menlo Park during that celebration. Edison and the rest of his family were out at the Henry Ford Museum. And, you know, Edison, you know, was just, you know, basically there for the big ceremony. And he hit a switch, which they say lit the eternal light here at Menlo Park. We're sure that there were some telephone conversations probably involved at that time, but it was huge. It was a huge celebration, you know, the Golden Jubilee. Creating a affordable and safe lighting system changed the world. And you know, we do have home fires today. You hear about them, but not to the extent that you heard about them at that time. Gas poisoning, there's so many things that were going on, and to have an affordable and well, you know, designed and easily to use lighting system was tremendous. So Edison was he was the most eligible bachelor in the world, you know, when his first wife died, and as I said, he was very heartbroken. You know, they married young, and they had been married for a number of years. But his good friend introduced him to Mina Miller, young, beautiful girl, and he courted her, and he fell in love pretty quickly and asked her to marry him. and they would marry in 1886. Now, Edison had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons with his first wife. He'll have 3 children with his second wife, 2 sons and a daughter there also. So he's a total of 6 children. And they would live their life at Glenmont, which is in West Orange. It's in the Llewellyn complex. And they would also have a summer home down in Fort Myers, Florida. And they would remain married until Edison's death at the age of 84 in 1931.